Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here on this curriculum day, our March curriculum day this year. I'm Superintendent Mike Morris. I'm just pleased to be here. I'm pleased for the program that's been designed for everyone. I think it'll be enriching, engaging, and kind of yet another show of our commitment to the critical work we have in meeting the needs of all of our students. Before we get into the program, just want to I'll speak very briefly this morning. Just a quick thank you. Tim Sheehan, Doreen Cunningham, and their teams did a tremendous amount of work organizing the morning program for us this morning. So I want to extend my appreciations to all the folks who worked on this. I also want to thank, there's a comment actually in the chat I was going to mention anyway. I want to thank so many of you for working collaboratively to make vaccine appointments available and accessible for members of the staff. I know some people are still working on that, but it's an incredible endeavor that people have taken on, and just seeing, how many people have worked within their staffs, within cross buildings, to support each other in that way has been tremendous. So I think it says a lot about you and a lot about the staff that we've seen this level of collaboration with early mornings for the early birds, and then the night owls staying up till midnight at 12:30, trying to help with that. So really, really appreciate all the work that you're doing. And last, before I more formally introduce our keynote speaker this morning, I think this is a time of change. I think we're all experiencing that. And one of the things that is consistent, regardless of whether we're in person or remote or any of those other aspects, is that even in times of change, our commitment to DEI, to diversity, equity, inclusion, is consistent. It doesn't depend on learning type. It doesn't depend on other variables. It's who we are as an organization and what we're striving to be as we look for improvement about what our environment is for our faculty and staff, what our environment is for students, and what we believe in as an organization. And so with us today to help with that and help assist with that is Kimmy Carlos. Kimmy is the CEO and founder of Kimmy Carlos Motivational Consulting, the co-founder of the Sister Wellness Retreats, Healing Spaces for Black Women, and the founder of Urban Mental Health Alliance, advocating for healthy minds in urban communities. So this keynote is Kimmy's going to start us off. There will be a time for questions later on in her after her presentation, and then we'll have breakout groups to continue that work for the rest of the morning. But thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your tremendous work for students. Thank you for how much of yourselves you've shown for students, especially in this virtual environment. It's opened a lot of doors, not just for seeing what's going on for families and homes and children, but for ourselves as well. And I appreciate your openness to that. And with that, I'm going to bring Kimmy Carlos onto the stream. So Kimmy, thank you for joining us here in Amherst. Really appreciate your presence and your presentation and the wisdom you're going to share with us. So thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Mike. Good morning. Good morning. I am absolutely delighted to be here. And thank you to Amherst Pelham School District for having me. And thank you to all of you that are joining us today. I know that there are many other things that you could be doing, and I'm excited that you have me with you for your March Curriculum Day. I am indeed Kimmy Carlos. I'm excited to be here in front of you. I want to just share a few things before we actually jump into the presentation. So we are going to have an honest, authentic conversation today. We're going to be talking about racism. And we are living in a historic time right now, because for the first time in our country, we're having authentic, transparent conversation around what systemic racism looks like and how that has affected our families and our communities. And so I'm excited because I have had several opportunities to talk to school districts about how we can begin to dismantle some of our most oppressive infrastructures and systems and begin to start creating life-affirming infrastructures for our youth. So with that, I want to just share a couple of things. I want you to be open-minded, and I also want you to be comfortable being uncomfortable, because we know that this is not an easy conversation. It's a necessary conversation, and I'm excited that we're having it, but it's not an easy conversation, right? And so this is a safe space. What that means is if there's questions that you want to ask, I am absolutely open to that. Now is the time to be able to ask and get those questions answered. So please feel free to do that, right? Because it's not every day you have a safe space to talk about such a sensitive topic. And I want to provide space to do that today. So I am going to be in front of you for just about 50 minutes to an hour. Have a great presentation for you. If you haven't already, go ahead and get yourself a notepad and a pen or a pencil, or get your Chromebook if you want to take notes. If you need to get something to drink, go ahead and do that, because I want to make sure you get this information. At the end of the presentation, I'm going to come back into the virtual room. I'm going to open the floor up for questions. That's going to be for about 20, 25 minutes. And then I'm going to leave you with a question of my own for you to kind of think through. Okay, so let's get started. I'm excited. Mike, I'm going to share my screen, and if anything doesn't look right, just let me know. But I think I know what I'm doing. Application window. Okay. And there we go. All right, so we are here for youth and the trauma of systemic racism. And again, I am Kimmy Carlos, and my consulting firm is Kimmy Carlos Motivational Consulting. And again, I want to thank you for being here today, but I also want to thank you for being an educator in a time that is so not normal, right? I can only imagine how challenging it's been for our educators in the past year, who 1 year ago this month had to do a sudden pivot, right, from in-classroom learning to remote learning, and suddenly try and figure out how you can continue to educate and empower your students in a virtual world that none of us were prepared for. So I want to thank you for all the hard work that you've done. In addition to thanking you again for being here today, regardless of what your role is at Amherst Pelham today, your role is change maker. And the reason you're a change maker is because you are going to get information today that's going to make you think, and it's going to give you the opportunity, if you feel so empowered, to make change, positive change in the lives of your students and their families and your overall community. So I want to share a little bit about myself. I am a trauma and alcoholism survivor. This past November, I celebrated 19 years clean and sober. I fell into alcoholism early at an age 14 because of some traumas that I had as a child. The biggest trauma being I lost my mother to suicide. And when I came into recovery after more than 20 years in active alcoholism, I became really passionate about mental and emotional wellness and learning how to manage trauma, learning how to manage PTSD, social anxiety disorder, and chronic clinical depression, all of which I was suffering from, right? I went on to publish a book that really shares my journey through alcoholism into recovery and all the strategies that I learned on how to manage my mental and emotional wellness, because I made a commitment that I wanted to spend the rest of my life sober. I wanted to be a productive role model for my children. And I wanted to make sure that I honored my mother by doing the advocacy work so that no other child would ever lose a parent to suicide. So I've gone on to be a motivational speaker. I do a lot of speaking around mental and emotional wellness and trauma, anti-racism and social justice, equity and justice. I am a program designer, so I design a lot of different programs and facilitate programs around wellness. I'm a wellness and empowerment coach. I'm a mental and emotional wellness advocate, so I create space wherever I am so that people feel empowered to learn about managing their mental health and wellness. I'm a nonprofit founder of the Urban Mental Health Alliance. I am a certified anti-racism trainer with the New Jersey Episcopal Church. But I am most proud of the fact that I am daughter of 1968 Olympian Dr. John W. Carlos. Many of you may recognize that name if you're of my generation. My father is Dr. John Carlos on the right-hand side. Many of you remember this demonstration on the podium during the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City during the national anthem. People have often called it a protest, or they've called it a Black Power salute. But in the Carlos family and in the Smith family, Tommy Smith in the center there, we call this a demonstration. What most people don't know is that my father, John Carlos, and Tommy Smith and Peter Norman on the left were demonstrating regarding humanity and equality for all. So they were demonstrating not just for the poor Black and brown families in the United States, but all around the world. There was a lot of poverty in Mexico City at the time during these Olympics. And Peter Norman, who is passed now, was also part of this demonstration. And the only reason he didn't have his hands in the sky is because he did not have a glove. But if you go and do the homework in Google, you'll see that there were many other symbolisms draped across all three of them to show this demonstration, right? So my father spoke specifically about all of the Black service workers in Harlem who had no money, including his parents, right? And knowing that he was on the world stage and being lauded for, at the time, being a bronze medalist, but knowing that when he came back to the United States, there was going to be challenges around his employment, his humanity, and the safety of his wife and his young daughter at the time, which was me. And so I've sat back and watched my father for more than 50 years do this work as a motivational speaker, as a publisher of 2 books. He was a high school administrator for more than 30 years, and how passionate he's been about equality and equity and justice. And so if I am half of the change maker that he is, I will have lived a well life. So that gives you an idea of why I'm so passionate about the work that I do. So today we're going to have a conversation about structural, institutional, systemic racism. It's important for you to understand that the conversation we're getting ready to have is not about personal behavior. It's about infrastructure, right? And I want to make sure that we understand that. So let's look at some words that I think are really important. What is discrimination? Discrimination is a prejudicial treatment of a person or persons based solely on their membership in a certain group or category. Discrimination is the actual behavior towards members of another group. It involves excluding or restricting members of one group from opportunities that are available to other groups. What is prejudice? Prejudice is a positive or negative attitude towards individuals based upon their membership in a particular social group. And what is bigotry? Bigotry is intolerance towards those who hold different opinions from oneself. Quote, the difficulties of combating prejudice and bigotry. All of us have the capacity as human beings to be discriminatory, prejudiced, and bigoted. That's part of our nature, right? We all have those dark sides of ourselves. And because of different ways that we've been socialized to view, quote unquote, the other, right? We all have the ability to be discriminatory, prejudiced, and bigoted. However, that is not racism. People typically confuse racism or quote unquote racist behaviors with discrimination and bigotry and prejudice. But racism is indeed a system. It is an infrastructure. Racism is reflected in societal disparities relating to wealth, income, criminal justice, employment, housing, healthcare, education, and political power. So to give you just a brief background, race is not a biological factor. It's not a thing. It is a human construct. And if you do your homework on where the construct of race came from, it was created well before the 1600s as a strategic way to separate those who would be in power and those who would not. And it just so happened that that was divided based on skin color. And then, of course, there were an entire group of quote unquote scientists that created pseudoscience to try and prove which humans were superior and which humans were subhuman. And that is how the construct of race began. And it was on that construct that all of our infrastructures in the United States have been created. So it literally infuses every part of our society. There is no part of our United States culture that systemic racism has not been weaved into the fabric of. So when you hear me talk about racism, I'm talking about an infrastructure. I'm talking about the distribution of wealth. I'm talking about the distribution of income. I'm talking about our criminal justice system. I'm talking about our employment system, talking about political power. And what we're going to get really specific about today is how systemic racism affects the lived experience of our Black and Brown children and their families. So because of that very, very brief definition, because racism is so involved, there's so many layers, right, that I literally could teach for 3 days and we will not even begin to tap into how complex racism is. But because of the construct of race and the way our country has been built on racist infrastructures and socialized to believe those racist infrastructures, we all have what we call implicit bias. And that implicit bias is a vicious cycle because the structural racism supports implicit bias and the implicit bias supports the structural racism. So I'm going to ask you to indulge me, and I just want to read a little bit to you about this chart, which I feel is just so powerful. So dominant narratives about race, family, media, and society, coupled with racialized structural arrangements and differential outcomes by race, all prime us to believe that people of color are inferior to white people, create and maintain harmful associations, and lead us to make harmful assumptions consciously and unconsciously about people of color. Race is created to justify enslaving people from Africa for economic engine of our country. Policies and practices are consolidate and protect power, bestow unearned economic, social, cultural, and political advantage to people called white, quote unquote, and unearned disadvantage to people of color, quote unquote. National narratives, ideology, belief systems about people of color being less than human and less than white justifies mistreatment and inequality, white supremacy. Inequitable outcomes and experiences resulting from policy decisions in health, housing, employment, education, and life expectancy reinforces white supremacist beliefs and ideology. Dominant narrative uses disparate outcomes as evidence of white superiority, promotes whiteness as normal and desirable, and justifies inequality. So again, for those who are feeling really uncomfortable right now, and that should be everybody in the room, remember we are talking about infrastructures. So we're not talking about specific behaviors, but we are talking about the way we've been socialized to believe certain things about certain populations in our country, right? And that's whether we are consciously or unconsciously aware of that. So we have a vicious cycle, which means as a country, as a very young country, or as our youth poet laureate says, an unfinished country, as all of those things, we have a lot of work to do. So I want to talk specifically about structural racism in education. And this slide comes from Erase Racism. And it talks about what structural racism looks like in education in very general terms. I am not an educator. You are the experts of your experience as educators. I'm sharing information based on research. And so I want to make that clear that in no way am I the expert on racism in education, but I want to share with you just a general sense of the research around that. So if you look at this chart on the left, it shows you, again, the vicious cycle that structural racism has in our communities, right? Because schools influence employment and career prospects, and employment impacts income and access to housing. And then housing discrimination causes residential segregation and unequal education opportunities, right? And it becomes a vicious cycle. And we're going to look at some of the systems that often oppress communities and keep communities in poverty, which we know affects the education of those communities, right? So what is it? What is structural racism in education? Structural racism is the historical and ongoing racial discrimination and segregation of African Americans, Blacks in particular, but also Latinos, Asians, which is typically instigated or sanctioned by government. Structural racism creates inequality in every aspect of life. So it would be easy to say, well, it doesn't affect education, but it absolutely does. And because it affects education, it means that our youngest students who are going into preschool and kindergarten at 4 and 5 are already being affected by structural racism in the very beginning of their psychological, emotional foundation and development. So as educators, I'm sure you're aware of adverse childhood experiences. These are pretty profound. I, believe it or not, did not learn about ACEs until I want to say maybe 10 years ago. And I literally stumbled upon it. I was at a conference with a colleague, and it was a conference on trauma. And we went to a workshop, and I thought adverse childhood experiences, the title was so fascinating. So I went to this workshop and I was handed a test. And I was asked to answer 10 questions. And I answered these 10 questions. And out of those 10 questions, I had 9 on the ACEs scale. I had 9 on the ACEs scale, 9 adverse childhood experiences I had had in my life as a child, right? And it brought back memories that I had suppressed for years. And I'm grateful that at that time I had been in recovery long enough and had done the personal work long enough where I was able to embrace that and actually feel affirmed by it, because for the first time in my life, I realized that my alcoholism was not what was wrong with me, but it was what had happened to me. So understanding adverse childhood experiences is a powerful tool in learning to begin to build infrastructures that are life affirming. So just as a review, traumatic events that can have negative lasting effects on health and well-being. So looking at household challenges, right? Domestic violence, substance abuse, mental illness, parental separation, divorce, or an incarcerated parent, abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional neglect, physical neglect, right? People with 6 or more ACEs can die 20 years earlier than those who have none. 1/8 of the population have more than 4 ACEs. 67% of the population have at least 1 ACE. 4 or more ACEs will actually cause a person to be 3 times the level of lung disease and adult smoking, 14 times the number of suicide attempts, 4.5 times the more likely to develop depression, 2 times the level of liver disease, 4 times as likely to have begun intercourse by age 15, and 11 times the level of intravenous drug use. And if you look at the chart on the bottom right, where it talks about the lifespan, right? So a child as young as 2 and 3, or even trauma in the womb, right? Starting out with adverse childhood experiences, finds that they have disrupted neural development, social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, adoption of health risk behaviors, disease, disability, social problems, and early death, right? The interesting thing, and we're going to talk more about this, is that often Black and brown families and communities are faulted for their own their own oppression, and the behaviors that come out of being oppressed and marginalized. So it's easy for people to look at this chart and say, well, if there's challenges in the household, then the household needs to do a better job, right? The parents just shouldn't abuse their children, right? Or they just shouldn't neglect them. Well, the parent just shouldn't end up in prison, right? It's easy to actually blame those who are oppressed for their own behaviors. But this next slide, I think, is even more powerful. And this comes from ACE's connection, because if you look at this tree of what's going on in the household: incarcerated family member, divorce, homelessness, parental mental illness, physical and emotional neglect, bullying, domestic violence, maternal depression, emotional and sexual abuse, alcoholism and drug abuse. It's easy again to say, well, they need to do a better job in the household. But if you look at the roots of these things: historical trauma, substandard schools, structural racism, lack of social capital and mobility, poor water and air quality, which is environmental injustice, right? Violence, poverty, which is strategic financial oppression, substandard wages, which is unemployment or underemployment, right? Poor housing quality and affordability, which is housing justice, right? Lack of jobs. All of these things that are in the community, again, born out of systemic racism, clearly is going to affect not only what's going on in the household, but what's going on in the community at large. And then if you look at a lot of your environmental issues that often happen in our poorest communities, right? A lot of our climate crisis, a lot of our natural disasters, if you think about poor drinking water and mold and vermin infestation and asbestos and a whole host of other environmental injustices, all of these affect students and their families and their communities. And unfortunately, because of the way Black and brown populations have been socialized in this country, we have a tendency to adultify and criminalize our Black and brown youth. And when I say Black and brown, I want to be specific. In this country, we view those who are of African descent as Black. That is whether you are Black British, Black American, Black Mexican, Black African, Black Canadian, Black Caribbean. If you are of African descent, you get lumped into the Black category. Just like if you are of European descent, whether you're Irish or Jewish or Italian or Greek, right? You get lumped into the white category, right? And brown is Latino or Latinx, Asian, East Asian, right? So just to give you an idea, when I say Black and brown youth, we have a tendency to adultify and criminalize Black and brown youth. And I want to give you some examples of that. We have young white men who have literally committed mass murder and have safely made it to the jailhouse. We have young Black girls and boys who have been arrested and brutalized and processed through the justice system for behaviors that are often born out of poverty and trauma. And nobody has looked at those as health conditions or health crises, right? We have youth that have been slaughtered in the streets, whose bodies have been shown on national television to be lying in the streets. The gunshots have been heard on the nightly news. And nobody is recognizing that as a crisis for our youth. We have youth that are struggling with human trafficking, sexual trafficking, substance use disorder, homelessness, that are literally being arrested and imprisoned. We have youth that are going to prison for decades for shoplifting. We have police officers in our poorest, most urbanized schools that are policing Black and brown bodies. And we often wonder why we have Black and brown youth that are falling into gangs, falling into gang warfare, falling into drug warfare, falling into sexual trafficking. If you've been socialized to believe that you, as a Black and brown child, and everyone who looks like you is less worthy, is of less value, then it's easy to get caught up in negative behavior. But we don't see that as a crisis in this country. We see that as adult criminal behavior. It's an actual fact. There's research that Black students are punished more harshly and more frequently than white students for the same offenses. And I think what grieves me more than anything is the number of children that end up in the justice system at such a young age. I cannot fathom, for any reason at all, why this little boy on the left-hand side, who cannot be more than 4 or 5 years old, would ever be in handcuffs. I can't fathom it. I'm pretty sure that this child in the middle here is about 15. And the child on the right might be 20. I can't fathom why we would criminalize such small children and literally set them on a path in life that's going to lead them to failure, that's going to lead them to incarceration, that's going to lead them to homelessness, that's going to lead them to substance use disorder. But it goes back to the way we've been socialized to view Black and brown humanity, to believe that Black children are less than, to believe that brown children are not smart enough, not capable enough, not deserving enough. And again, we are not talking about individual behaviors. We're talking about infrastructures that continue to perpetuate the way we think about our most marginalized, most vulnerable children. I also want to talk about the media and how the media portrays our children, right? When we hear words like thug and savage and animal and vermin and super predator, right? Language matters and images matter, especially when you're a child. And if this is what you hear in the media, on social media, on television, on the radio, in newspapers, in magazines, then this is what you come to believe. What's always remarkable to me in the media is the way our children are displayed whenever there is any type of quote unquote criminal activity, right? The most scary pictures, that we can find of a child, right, is what's often shown in the media, right? And God forbid this child has been murdered by the police or anyone else. Bodies are literally shown laying in the street on social media. We literally stream the sounds of gunfire on the nightly news when there's a prominent murder in our country, right? We trot out any and everything that this young child or young adult may have ever done wrong in their life to imply that they deserve what they got, right? Conversely, we often look at white children who have committed literally mass murder and we're told that they had a mental health challenge, that they were bullied, that they were unstable, that they didn't get the support that they needed. And the pictures that we see are their graduation pictures or their prom pictures, right? Again, it's the way we've been socialized to portray our children and the dichotomy between children of color and children who are white. And all of this has a detrimental effect on the mental health of our children. So if you look at poverty and mass incarceration and drug infiltration and tensions between communities and law enforcement and drug warfare and gang warfare and sexual trafficking, and then you couple that with unconscious bias and adultification and criminalization, all in our communities, clearly that's going to affect our educational systems and it's going to weigh heavy on the mental health of our children. And our Black and brown children are dealing with levels of covert and overt racism and unconscious bias on levels that are so heavy and would be so crushing to adults. And yet when we see behaviors that come out of these traumas, we're not recognizing them as a health crisis. We're punishing them for simply being children who are in pain. I think this picture is so profound where it talks about worthlessness and grief and shame and depression and stress and being frustrated and feeling unloved and lonely and mad and anxiety and nervous and issues, right? One of the areas that I think is so important that we need to really think about with our youth is grief. Because grief comes in many forms. It's not just the grief of losing someone to death, but the grief of losing a parent or a loved one to incarceration, the grief of losing a parent or a loved one to substance use disorder or homelessness, the grief of your dreams literally being dashed when you begin to realize how limited your opportunities are, the grief of being treated less than human. That weighs heavy on our Black and brown children. It would weigh heavy on any child. But when you roll up systemic racism as part of the mix, it becomes a burden that is almost unsustainable for our children. And our children end up in prison, in homelessness, in substance use disorder, or dead. Our youth suicide statistics, the surge is particularly strong among teen boys, up 14% a year between 2015 and 2017. Suicide rates for teenage girls, meanwhile, rose 8% annually between 2000 and 2017. Tragically, teens can be vulnerable to suicide as they navigate the emotional pitfalls of growing up. And a new US study suggests Black teens might be the most vulnerable of all. Suicide rates among Black girls aged 13 to 19 rose 182% between 2001 and 2017, while the rate among Black teen boys rose 60% during that same time. So I think it's important to have this conversation around youth suicide because I think that we have, again, been socialized to believe that Black and brown children don't die by suicide. Not only do they die by suicide, but I think because of social media, things have become so much more clear. Because of mass incarceration and strategic drug infiltration, Black families and communities have been decimated. Because of social media, Black and brown children are bombarded with such negative images and beliefs. And I think all of this has a lot to do with why these numbers continue to rise. I want to just also talk about the impact that the last 4 years have had on our immigrant children and the horrors that they've experienced coming into this country, and how those traumas are going to affect them and their families for generations to come. I want to talk about the anti-hate that we're seeing across this country for our Asian children and brothers and sisters. Again, because of the language and the images that we've seen for the last 4 years. It's important to understand what we're talking about when we're talking about systemic racism. We are essentially talking about anybody who is not white. So what that means is, again, we can all be discriminatory and prejudiced and bigoted. But people of color do not have the collective power or privilege to show racist behaviors. And because people of color don't have that power or privilege, they are indeed the most marginalized in this country, regardless of what category they fall in, whether you're Black, Indigenous, American Indian, or a person of color. The experiences of racism are different, but racism affects everybody in this country who is a person of color. And those who are impacted the most are our most vulnerable, which are our youth. So what do we do, right? The horse is out of the barn. I mean, we've been dealing with systemic racism for more than 400 years now. We understand that race is a construct, therefore racism is a construct. We understand that all of us, white folks and people of color, have been socialized to believe in superiority and inferiority, right? And more or less, right? We all walk around with this concept like life is a giant pie. And if I give you more, then I'm going to have less, right? But if I can be philosophical for a moment, I want to share with you that I believe that our world has enough for everybody. We all have the ability to be affirmed. We all have the ability to receive equity in life. I believe that. It's not a matter of, well, if I give Black folks more, then I'll have less. Or if I give the immigrant more, then I'll have less. Or if the Asian comes over and opens up another store, then that's a store that I can't open up. All of that is distorted thinking, because equity affords us everything that we need in this world. It's a matter of changing the way we view the world from who is superior and who is inferior to how do we provide life-affirming systems? How do we as a community of change makers create life-affirming frameworks that support not just all our youth, but more specifically our Black, brown, and urban youth who are our most vulnerable and marginalized? And when I say life affirming, I mean giving life value, positive and optimistic quality of life, optimistic, understanding that you have opportunities, that you have choices, that the world belongs to you the same way it belongs to people who don't look like you, right? And frameworks are structures. What structures and systems, think policies and practices that we can put into place that not only support but empower our Black and brown and urban youth, right? If we begin to think not what's wrong with this child and their family, but what has happened to this child and their family, and how can we empower them? Because the truth is, people aren't interested in being saved. People are interested in being empowered. And people are the best experts of their lived experience. And if you listen long enough, people will tell you what they need. So I want to share with you 3 strategies that I think are really, really important to affirm students of color. And incidentally, I think that these are strategies that are not only for educators, but also for our community leaders, our parents, and our caregivers. These are strategies that all of us should be embracing and practicing to empower all students, but especially our students of color. So I think anti-racism is important. And the reason I think anti-racism is important is because if we don't address the elephant in the room, if we don't recognize the dragon that we really need to fight, then we struggle to really implement diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? So it's important that we recognize what racism looks like, where racism came from, and how to begin to dismantle it and replace it with equitable and just practices, equitable and just infrastructures, equitable and just systems, right? It's important that we have the education and the awareness and the knowledge. Racism is a scary word because we think of men riding in the middle of the night with white hoods and burning crosses. And absolutely, that is bigoted, violent, brutal behavior. But real racism is an infrastructure. And when we begin to understand that, then we can begin to work to dismantle it. I also think that ACEs training for educators is very important, again, because we have to know, all of us as community members and as change makers have to know what trauma looks like, right? That angry Black child is probably traumatized. And they're not disrupting your classroom just because they don't like you. They're probably in pain. Their humanity is saying, please listen to me. So understanding what adverse childhood experiences are and how to respond to that, how to create empowering environments for our most vulnerable children who are dealing with the most heavy of these experiences in their lives. And then specifically for our students, teaching them what wellness, resiliency, and self-advocacy looks like. And that's important. Again, for all students. But let me explain something. Most Black and brown folks in this country have not been taught what self-advocacy looks like. We've been socialized to believe that you are a person of color, therefore you do not have a voice, and you are in a place of service. We've been socialized to believe that we need to make sure everybody in the room is comfortable, because for centuries, when white folks were uncomfortable, Black and brown people were murdered. So we've been taught to be quiet and keep our heads down. And when I say that, I mean that literally and figuratively. So many of our Black and Brown students have not seen self-advocacy modeled in their homes and in their communities. We need to teach our students to have a voice and that their voice is of value and that they have a right to bring their voice into the room and into the table to speak to what their needs are. They need to learn how to find trusted sources, trusted adults that they can go to in confidence when they're struggling. We need to teach our students what wellness means: physical wellness, emotional, mental wellness, psychological wellness, financial wellness, spiritual wellness, right? That needs to be a priority, because when our students understand what wellness is, then they understand what crisis and illness looks like. And then building resiliency. Now, we all know that children are very resilient, but what if we were intentional about teaching them resiliency, right? We know that if a child has just one adult that they trust, that respects them, that appreciates them, that empowers them, an adult that they know is going to hold their confidence, their resiliency level is skyrockets. Now imagine having an entire school system and an entire community of adults that do that for our youth, for all of our youth, our Black youth, our brown youth, our white youth. What a generation we would build. So for resilience, we're talking about confidence, right? Having feelings of competence, effectiveness in coping with stressful situations, and strong self-esteem are inherent to feeling resilient. Social support, building good relationships with others and seeking support can help individuals overcome adverse situations. Adaptability, flexibility, and adapting to changing situations which are beyond our control are essential to maintaining resilience. And purposefulness, having a clear sense of purpose, clear values, drive, and direction helps individuals to persist and achieve in the face of setbacks. And self-advocacy, speaking up for yourself, staying informed, knowing your rights, finding support, problem solving, self-determination, and asking for help. So for 7 years, I was the founder and volunteer executive director for the Urban Mental Health Alliance. That's one of the things I am the most proud of. And we advocated for mental health and wellness and mental illness and substance use disorder recovery, specifically in urban communities. And when I say urban, I mean Black, brown, impoverished communities, right? And so we did a lot of workshops and panels, and we had a mental health and wellness conference, and we did festivals. And I had the pleasure of meeting so many people. And one of the things that I learned is that many people didn't understand what self-advocacy and resiliency was as adults, right? And so I began to design programs around what self-advocacy looked like, what resiliency looked like, right? So that adults could begin to learn this. What if we were to teach our children this while they're young, so that when they became adults, these are skills that they've already mastered? How different would our families be? How different would our communities be? So I love this slide. This is from Moving Forward, Building Culturally Safe Organizations. This is actually in Vancouver. This was a conference that was back in 2014. And I just think this slide is so powerful, right? It talks about healing tools and methods for youth, right? So it talks about music and building strong minds and bodies and spirits, and teaching children that they are beautiful people, and looking for positive teachers, right? Creating healing tools for ourselves, hearing our own anger, right? Finding somebody that you trust, finding art, being in nature, decolonizing the way we view education, right? I just think that this is such a powerful slide. And it talks about all the ways in which we can continue to build up our communities and in turn empower our youth. Another powerful slide talks about how we can strengthen our communities, right? So strengthen economic supports for families, change social norms to support parents in positive parenting, provide quality care and education early in life, enhance parenting skills to promote healthy child development, and intervene to lessen harms and prevent future risks. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that Amherst Pelham is more than likely working very hard to put these infrastructures in place, right? Just by virtue of the fact that you reached out to me and said, bring anti-racism training, speaks to how you value your students and their families and their communities. So a lot of this may not be new to you, but I want to validate and affirm how important these practices are. And I also want to validate and affirm how difficult it is to often institute them, right? Because there's so much injustice that has to be dismantled in order for us to put these positive infrastructures in place. So I don't want you to get the impression that I think any of this is simple, because I know it's not. But it's important. It's vital. It's necessary. Any organization, business, company, sector, discipline that is going to remain relevant and continue to operate from a place of integrity is going to have to focus on three things: wellness, dismantling racism, and building diversity, equity, and justice. So we're coming to the end. I want to share some resources. Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGruy is one of the most powerful books you will ever read if you have not had the opportunity to read it. If you're like me, who's like a bumblebee flitting from here to there, and you don't have time to actually sit down and read a book, get the audiobook. It gives you a real bird's eye view into why Black Americans think and behave the way they do. It has a lot to do with the generational traumas that have been passed down from times of colonization and enslavement, when African and African Americans were literally kidnapped and enslaved and sold like chattel in this country, right? And that's a part of our history that we don't like to discuss, but that history still is impacting Black families and communities to this day. And if you really want to dig into how that affects your Black students and their families, I strongly encourage you to read this book. Dr. Nadine Burke Harris is also powerful, and she is now the Surgeon General in California. And in her own words, she said she never set out to be a superstar. She just began to notice patterns in the children in her communities. And that's when she began to really understand what childhood adversity was and the long-term effects that it had on children in the communities. So the deepest well is all about adverse childhood experiences and really beginning to understand what that looks like and how we can begin to heal our children and their families. So 2 excellent books to start with. The Center for Racial Justice in Education, if you're not familiar with them, at the Center for Racial Justice in Education, we strongly believe that every educator has the power and potential to create racially just and equitable learning environments for the children in their care. They did not pay me for this little mention, but I strongly believe in the work that this organization does. I've been following them for a while now. Great organization to reach out to and potentially partner with. And then here are some general anti-racism resources for you. And I will actually, after this presentation is over, be sending a PDF of resources for you guys. And it will also have my contact information in it if you ever wanted to just reach out to me and, you had a question or wanted to have a brief conversation. I'm very open to that. I think that education, as I said, is so important. And these are some areas where you can really find a lot of information, right? Let me just make sure that you understand that this is not a sprint. This is a marathon. We are all responsible for doing the work, and we're all complicit in the systemic racism systems that we live in. White folks are complicit because they have privileges, whether they realize it or not, whether they want it or not. And people of color are complicit because if we really wanted to revolt, we'd be running around with torches burning buildings down. But we've learned that when we revolt in this country, we're often killed. So we remain complicit. But the way you make change is to become educated and knowledgeable, and then you can become strategic and intentional about dismantling the most oppressive infrastructures and building equity and justice, not just for ourselves, but for our children and our grandchildren. I have 6 grandchildren, 2 wonderful children who grew up by the grace of God and got married and are doing so wonderful. And between the 2 of them, they've given me 6 grandchildren. And it's those 6 grandchildren that I think about every day when I do the work around wellness and anti-racism, because I probably will not see the ideal world in my lifetime, but I have to believe that if I continue to do the work, my children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren are one day going to see the world that we all deserve. So I encourage you to view this as a marathon within the emotional and physical bandwidth that you have. Do the work to understand what racism and trauma looks like. And so I'm going to come into the room and I'm going to open the floor up to questions. And this is always the most exciting part for me because I love engaging with my change makers in the audience. But I want to leave you with a question of your own, right? I want to ask you, how can you, the change makers of Amherst-Pelham Regional School District, begin or continue to create life-affirming frameworks that support your students, their families, and their communities, right? So this question is for all of your students, your white students, your Black students, your brown students. How can we create frameworks that are equitable and just, that are life-affirming, that support all of our students? Because when we support all of our students in equitable ways, then we lift the entire community. So as I come into the room and answer your questions, I want you to think about this question, and I want you to take it back to your respective schools, and I want you to begin to think about how you can continue to do that and how you can be strategic and intentional and unabashed about doing it. And with that, I'm excited to come back into the room and answer any questions that you have. We can't hear you, Mike.
Sorry, can't be a virtual call without needing to be unmuted, right? But I wanted to say, I hope you're able to now see the comments now that your screen's off. Just an incredible number of appreciations. This should be coming on the right side of your screen, Ms. Carlos, for your presentation today.
There is a lot. I'm a little overwhelmed.
Yeah, they have a shirt they sell and a mug in Amherst, Ms. Carlos, and it says Amherst, where only the H is silent. Our folks will let us know how they think. There's no concerns about that here at all. Again, thank you for your presentation. Thank Doreen Cunningham, Tim Shee, and others who contributed to this day and making this presentation happen for our staff. And so. Now, at this point, if people do have questions, because, Ms. Carlos couldn't see those while she was presenting because that's what she was doing. So there's a couple in there, but certainly any questions, comments that people like Ms. Close to respond to. We do have about 25 minutes or so for more interactive dialogue, which I think we all really enjoy. So I'm going to start as people, because it's going to take a little while for these comments to come through. So I think one of the things that's a challenge for everyone, and including myself, is that when you have when you're working in an organization, sometimes it can feel like individuals are, sort of, it's a challenge in a large organization to make a difference. And I don't know what advice you'd give on an individual staff person level, and I'm talking about any staff member, not necessarily a specific role. What would be a next step that you would, recommend on the personal growth side of things about making that difference for students, families, in our community?
Yes, excellent question. So the first thing, as I shared, is the education and the knowledge piece, right? And so whether you do that individually or collectively as a district, you want to begin to do the learning around what racism looks like and what trauma looks like, because they literally go hand in hand, right? So you want to begin to do the work around what that looks like. And as I said, I'll share resources, but there's a myriad of resources out there, okay? Because once you have the education, then you can do the next best thing, which I think is so important. And I call that find your lane, okay? What that means is within your passion and your expertise, that's where you want to begin to do the work. Okay, so I'm going to assume the folks in this room are passionate about education, right? Because we have educators. So that's one lane where you want to begin to do the work to dismantle oppressive barriers, right? But what about personally? What are you passionate about? And if you don't know, then just think about what's made you angry in the last 4 years, right? Is it women's reproductive rights? Is it voting? Is it environmental justice? Is it immigration? What has really made you angry and got you thinking that there needs to be a change, right? That's your lane. Because systemic racism is so ingrained in the very fabric of our country, you could pick any area to begin to do the work, okay? And it starts with a foundation of understanding what racism looks like and then looking at the different opportunities to make that change. And there's organizations that are doing it. Here in New Jersey, we have an organization called Social Justice Institute of New Jersey. We have Not in Our Town, and a whole host of other movements and organizations that are really doing the work in the communities. I guarantee you, Amherst, did I say that right? And Pelham also, it has organizations that are doing the work, right? Align yourself with organizations that are doing that work. Again, within your emotional and physical and psychological bandwidth. Some folks are going to say, you know what? I just don't have the emotional bandwidth to do that, but I've got finances. I'm going to find an organization that I want to support financially because I believe in the work that they're doing. I also think it's important, and I actually teach a 4-hour anti-racism training class. And so I couldn't give you everything I wanted to give you in 1 hour, right? But one of the things I think is really, really important is for our Black and brown folks in the room, our Black and brown educators. I see you. I hear you. I know you're exhausted. I know you're dealing with trauma. I know this is frustrating. I know that you often feel like your voice is not being heard. So I'm going to give you permission, not because I'm anybody important, but because often when we hear it out loud, right, then it validates. I'm going to give you permission to make your wellness the priority, which means you are not obligated to do any work around dismantling racism before you are at a place where you feel healthy emotionally and psychologically. Please understand that. Do not feel like, well, gee, Kimmy Carlos told me as a Black man, I have to run out and I have to fix everything. That's not what I'm saying. Your wellness is absolutely the number one priority before you ever have to make a decision around doing any anti-racism work. But within your emotional capacity, start with the knowledge and the education first, and then find your lane. Because when you're in your lane, it's not going to feel like work. It's going to feel like empowerment.
So I'm gonna post some questions, and there's a lot of them. So I'm gonna try to do my best, but I apologize if they're coming in fast and furious. But here's a question: what advice do you have regarding balancing the attentive to ACEs and other traumas while holding high expectations for students?
Ooh, that's an excellent question. So I, again, am not an educator. So it might be a little hard for me to answer that question. I also want to say that I understand that educators were not taught, right, to handle trauma and handle racism, right? So I'm sure you're looking at your plate like, this is not what I expected to be doing, you know? So I think that's an excellent question to have with your superintendent and your other senior leadership around what are constructive ways that you can begin to build that.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to skip around a little bit. Another question. Thank you so much for your presentation. Also wondering how to promote an asset model of students versus a deficit model, especially as viewed by white educators.
So talk to me about asset model versus deficit model.
So I think, so I'm not Irene, but I know Irene, and I think where this is coming from, and Irene, I know you're watching. If I get this wrong, please put it in the chat so that I get it right. But I think that sometimes when educators are viewing students who have had some traumas, that we talk a lot about the traumas, and perhaps I think it's related to the other question, in my opinion, lower expectations is a concern. Like, are we lowering our expectations around this? Right. And how do we focus on the strengths that students bring, not only the challenges they've had, because sometimes that can lead us to some thinking that doesn't actually promote their growth. If we're only thinking about the deficits and not all the valuable aspects that every child brings to our district. So, Irene, I apologize. You would have said it much more succinctly and probably clearly if you were on this end of the call. But I think that's where Irene's headed with that question.
I love the language, and so I'm going to go back and do my homework on asset model versus deficit model. But if I'm hearing correctly, what we're talking about is implicit bias, right, or unconscious bias, right? And so if we're looking at those children who have had some challenges, we might not necessarily recognize their potential and their capabilities, right? And again, that has a lot to do with the way we've been socialized, right? So we see a little Black or brown child who's quote unquote misbehaving or acting out, and we immediately think, that this child has no value. They have no capacity to rise to the level of where we think they need to be, right? That's where you get microaggressive comments like, oh, they're so articulate, or oh, they're so capable, because it's almost as if you're surprised to realize that's true, right? So this is what I always tell people in every sector that I work in, whether it's education or banking or retail, or think humanity first. When you see this little child, and I don't care how old they are, if they're 5 in kindergarten or they're 17 in the 11th grade, when you see this child, think humanity, think human being, think heart, think eyes and ears and mouths, right? Think spirit, think soul, think vision and dreams and beliefs. Think about the opportunities that could be afforded to them, right? Focus on the child and not the behavior, because the behavior is separate from the child, right? So you want to find why that behavior is happening so that you can empower the child that's being hidden behind that behavior. Because when we have a child that gets angry and they're throwing chairs across the room, we're focused on the chair. We're not focused on the child. And I understand that you've got 20 other children in the room that you need to keep safe. I totally get that. So what practices can we create that will empower that child who's in so much pain that they're throwing chairs across the room, right? And I can speak to that personally because I've had a child and a grandchild who's done that in class, okay? So you want to make sure you're looking at the humanity behind the behavior. And it's going to take you some time to have that mind shift. And again, the more education you have, the more you'll begin to normalize making sure that there's equity for all of your children.
Thank you. Another one from Marcia. Appreciate your explanation why we must teach parents and students self-advocacy. What suggestions do you have to empower BIPOC caregivers around that advocacy piece?
Yes, excellent. So I had the wonderful opportunity of being the board vice chair for a charter school here in Trenton, New Jersey. And one of the things that I've really worked hard with the school is doing just that, empowering not just our students, but our parents and our caregivers and our families, right, that these students go home to every day. And so what I believe is every opportunity that we give our students to learn, we need to be giving our parents and caregivers and families the opportunity to learn. And how easy or how much easier is it to do it right now while we're in remote learning, right? And so if we're teaching advocacy courses to our students, is there an opportunity to teach those advocacy courses to our parents? If we're teaching finances to our students, are there opportunities to create short finance workshops for our parents? Are there certain parenting skills that we can teach to our parents and caregivers without judgment and in a way that would be empowering? How can we invite our parents and our caregivers into the school to feel like they have a voice when it comes to the education of the students? How do we invite them as volunteers? Are there committees that we can create that they can come and sit on to be a part of, right? You empower people by bringing them to the table and giving them the resources and the information that they need. Now, what that means is you have to take your savior hat off, because again, people are their own best experts of their lived experience. So you don't want to assume that you know what their parents and caregivers and families need. You want to bring them to the table and then amplify their voices so that you begin to hear what they need and you begin to work with them to empower them.
Thank you. Next question comes from Amy. How do we prioritize the emotional well-being of students on the heels of a traumatic year on top of existing trauma? And I think this is, all these questions are excellent. And I think this is on the top of our minds as we know that students are undergoing multiple traumas that are novel in addition to the traumas that pre-existed COVID.
Yeah, this has been such a difficult year. Not only for our students, but for their parents and their caregivers and their communities, and for our educators and our administrators and our healthcare professionals, and such a challenging year. And the isolation of being remote and virtual certainly does not help, right? And then if you think about those students and families who may have already been in crisis because of poverty or because of abuse or because of substance use disorder or a whole host of other, traumas and crisis that families go through, it compounds it even more, right? And so one of the things that I think is really, really important that I encourage educators to do is partner with the mental health organizations in your communities. Okay, so the National Alliance of Mental Illness, that's the organization where I actually got started as an advocate. I had a child that was actually threatening suicide, and we ended up in parent-child group therapy. And I was very early on in recovery, so I was just trying to stay sober. And all of a sudden I have this child that doesn't want to live anymore. And I was introduced to the National Alliance of Mental Illness, and that is where I really began to learn about what mental illness is and how to advocate for your own mental health and wellness. They're an awesome organization. They have a national office in Virginia, but they actually have a chapter in every single state. And then also the Mental Health Association is another national program that also typically has a chapter in every state. So in New Jersey, it's the Mental Health Association in New Jersey. These are two awesome organizations that school districts can reach out to and find out ways to partner to bring programs into the school that will not only teach your educators, but will also work with you to teach your students and their families, right? What healthy practices are for your mental and emotional wellness, but also how to recognize crisis. The next thing I would offer is mental health first aid, which is another awesome resource. And there is a youth mental health first aid training program, which I am actually certified to teach. It's a day-long program that actually teaches you what youth mental illness looks like, what youth crisis is. So how to recognize a child who is potentially suicidal, who is in substance use disorder, who has anxiety disorder, eating disorders, bipolar disorder, psychosis, schizophrenia. It's an awesome program. Again, it'll teach you how to recognize mental illness, and it'll teach you how to prioritize getting help for families and youth that need it, as well as how to empower people with managing and making their mental and emotional wellness a priority. So those are all suggestions that I think are extremely helpful for our school districts, especially, right now.
Great. Thank you. Time for a couple more questions. This one kind of goes on 2 slides. When we return to in-person school, we need to take drastic measures to help our students cope with the trauma and lasting mental health impacts of the pandemic. What can we do to prioritize joy, community, and connection?
Oh man, I'm so happy you said that. I'm so happy you said that question. I tell this story all the time. So a couple years ago, I had the chance to meet Dr. Angela Davis. She came to Princeton, and I was so fortunate to be able to go to dinner with her. And so I asked her, I said, this is hard work, being a change maker, trying to disrupt, systems and create a better world. This is really hard. Like, how do you've been doing this for 50 years. You've been doing this right alongside my dad for decades now. But there are folks, like me, who came to this game late in life. I didn't start doing this work till I was in my 40s, as well as students, who are just embarking on this journey. How do you do this? And she said to me, you chase joy. You keep the joy in your life, right? You make joy a priority because that's what feeds your soul and your spirit to do the hard work. So you make time for joy, right? So for me, joy is my grandchildren. No matter what I do, I build them into my life as a priority, and I make room and space for them. Yes, come run around my living room, make all the noise you want, because that is a joyful time for me, okay? So as a school district, think about ways that you can build joy into the lives of your students and into your community as a whole. How do you partner to create joyful events? How do you build a joyful culture? Are there joyful activities, right? And that, again, is going to take a lot of communication with your students and their families to see what brings them joy, right? And I agree. I think that needs to be an absolute priority. Now, what does that look like? Well, there's a difference between joy and happiness. Happiness is temporary, right? It's fleeting, right? I am very happy about my cup of coffee that I had before I came on this morning, but the coffee's gone, right? But joy is meaning. You find joy in meaningfulness. That's where the joy comes, which is why joy is often long sustaining, because there's meaning within joy. We find joy in meaningful things. My grandchildren are meaningful to me. They are my legacy. They are my immortality. So I find joy in that. So what do your students and their families and their communities find joy in? And how can you build partnerships to create a joyful culture in your schools?
Thank you. Time for 1 or 2 more. So Allison asks, and I think this is a nice segue from where you were, because I think this is a place where, I've heard a lot of folks get stuck, which is we want to have high expectations. We want our support students to be able to have choices in whatever their post-secondary steps are, and the joy. And I think everyone, myself included, believes that's a false dichotomy. But I think any thoughts you have about what makes that dichotomy false, about having, providing what students need to have choices in their lives after they leave us, but also maintaining that joy. So I'd love, Allison's question, but I appreciate it and agree with it. I wonder if you could offer us any tips or pearls about how those two aren't really in opposition, because I think it's this one's a challenging one for us in the educational realm.
Right. I think this is a good question. And at the risk of sounding simplistic, I don't think that they are different. I don't understand how high expectations can't also be joyful, right? And so for me, it sounds like, again, not being an educator, the way I envision it is you normalize education and the high expectations, and then you make that a fun thing, right? So in other words, this is not punishment. This is a joyful, fun part of life for you, growing and learning and development, right? It should not be either you can be joyful or you can have high expectations, but you can't have them together, right? And so you're going to have these high expectations and you're going to go on and do wonderful things in life, but you're going to be miserable, right? Or you can just be joyful and keep your expectations low. I don't believe that. I think that you can marry the two. So how do you make those high expectations a joyful thing, right? And again, this might sound simplistic, but you can catch more flies with honey than you can with vinegar. So how do you get your students excited about these high expectations? And how do you not judge those students who may not rise to those expectations as easily, or who may learn differently, or who may need different resources in order to be equitable, right? How do you manage all of that in a way that's going to be empowering and exciting and fun for the student, right? I don't think that they are on opposite ends. For me, I think they should be one and the same, right? Who wants high expectations if I'm going to be miserable? Right.
Thank you. And if I could jump in just to add to that, I mean, I think when I was a new teacher at Fort River, one of our elementary schools here 20 years ago, and think about the mentors I had, I think one of the things I learned was about the authenticity of self can marry those two. That I was 23 years old, and there's probably 23-year-olds in the call. That's not an ageist comment. It's just where I was at 23, and I thought I had to be a certain way. And what I saw from the educators who I learned from is, if they were truly authentic in themselves, they were able to marry those two really well. There were joyous rooms, and there certainly was high expectations. And so I think we've had a lot of experience this year in a remote setting of being sort of as I kind of referenced at the beginning, sort of by default, people were seeing our bedrooms or our living rooms or, all those things. And I think we've had a lot of experience sharing more of ourselves. It's really good. It was a Washington Post article the other day about this, sharing more of ourselves with our students and their families than we ever had before by the nature of the pandemic and our instructional model. And I think how to bring that back to the classroom as we go, head in that direction, sooner or a little later, is going to be really critical. But I think utilizing what we've learned this year about how to connect with students is going to be really helpful. And just think of those models that you see, and I won't mention names, but those of you who are in Fort River 20 years ago will know who I'm talking about, because they know a grade I used to teach, and just really, they were themselves, and they were able to bring that joy actually, and that contributed to the high expectations in the room.
So, I want to speak to that for a minute. Please. I want to say two things, if you'll allow me. So the first one is, yes, one of the things that we've all had to learn is that we are going to be showing our real authentic selves in this virtual world, right? I have a cat. She's my furry best friend. And I have been in like real serious board meetings or presentations, and my cat will suddenly decide to run across the screen, and all of a sudden everybody's like, oh, because it's something real, it's authentic, it's human, right? So yes, there's a lot to be said for authenticity. However, I don't want us to be naive. I want us to understand that not everybody is given room to be their authentic selves. And our Black and brown folks often don't feel that we have the freedom to do that. Now, I've reached a point in life where, I am who I am. I mean, if I'm going to talk anti-racism, then there's not much else that scares me except maybe spiders and snakes, right? But it took me years to get here because I have the emotional bandwidth to do this work. There are Black and brown folks in this room right now who are saying, I don't have the psychological safety to be authentic. I don't have the physical safety to be authentic. I don't have the emotional bandwidth to be authentic because it makes me vulnerable. So if we're going to talk about people being authentic, we need to make sure we're creating a safe culture for people to do that. It's really important.
Yeah, thank you for that additional piece. It's incredibly helpful. I think this is 9:42. I know Tim's going to make sure that we transition on time, but I think we have time for one more question, if that's okay with you, Kimmy.
Absolutely.
So Grace asks, how do we keep liberation of our students and families of color at the center of our work? Asking as a white educator looking to disrupt how I perpetuate white supremacist culture.
Excellent question. So when I send over the resources, I'm going to send over a couple of sheets that are going to talk about what it means to be an ally. Now, I know that, there's a little bit of controversy around the word ally, and you should really be a disruptor and blah, blah, blah. But I believe in the word ally. What ally means is I'm going to come alongside you, and I am going to empower you with my privilege, and I'm going to amplify you and your voice. That's what ally means, okay? And so I'm going to be sharing a few tips around how to do that. But again, I know I sound like a broken record. It goes back to the education piece, because folks who live with a sense of privilege and entitlement understandably believe that they have all the answers. You're going to have to shift your mindset and understand that you don't have answers for experience you haven't lived. So it has to start with the education piece, right? To begin to understand what racism is, what the lived experience of racism is, what the history and construct of race and racism is, starts there. And then you can begin to build your skills as an ally, right? And that way you begin to amplify voices and empower voices, as opposed to saying, oh, I'm going to pull a rabbit out of my hat and fix it for you. Okay. So do the work, and I'll make sure that you have resources that will help you, begin that journey or continue on that journey as an ally.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being here this morning. Thank you for sharing more resources, because this is going to continue. We all need to continue to learn. And thanks for contributing to that. And, there were incredible number. Thanks you for letting us, into your home, quite literally. But most importantly, thanks for sharing all the thoughts that you had that'll make us better educators tomorrow when our students are in class. So,
it was my absolute pleasure. I would love to ask if it's possible if I could get a copy of the comments.
Yep. I will, after we get off this, I can follow up offline, but I can email you how to access that.
I would love that, just because I see so many wonderful comments, and I really want to make sure I get a chance to read them.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'm going to pull Tim on, but I think before I do, just one other comment. I'm not able to, it's too far to scroll up because, as you note, there's so many comments, but I just want to appreciate Carol Carson's comment that it was a long time ago, but I'm in for the marathon, right? And I think that's the spirit with which we need to enter the work. So I appreciate Carol for that perspective. And I think that framing that you had, I think it sets us out with an ambitious but long-term path that will be better tomorrow for today. We won't be resolved tomorrow, and that's not the goal. The goal is to be working as hard as we can, as fast as we can along that path to be the district that we want to be. So thank you for your contribution to everyone on this call in the district. Really, really appreciate it. And I will follow up with you offline to get the comments in the recording, so you have that as well.
It's absolutely been my pleasure. Thank you again for your time and for having me. And I wish you a wonderful spring.
Thanks to you as well.
Okay.
I'm going to hop off. I'm going to have Tim come on. I'll hop off with you, Kimmy, and we can follow up on that. And Tim, thanks for your work on this, Tim. And Tim's going to describe some next steps for everyone else on the call.
All right. Thank you, Kimmy, and thank you, Mike, for running that for us this morning. That was really spectacular. I know that I could have listened to Kimmy for several more hours. It went by really quickly. It was beyond what I imagined. So much incredible information for us to think about. And so thank you, everybody, for joining us this morning. You're going to have some time to take a break now. We have breakout sessions starting at 10 o'clock, and I will send an all-staff email in a moment with the links for all the breakout sessions that you got the other day. Please join the session that best fits your role. For some of you overlap different roles in the district, so feel free to choose the session that best matches you. Give each other space. I'm sure a few people will be running a little bit late entering their sessions. There are facilitators in each group, and thank you to the facilitators for being willing to help to guide the discussion in those sessions. But really, we set these up so that everyone would have an opportunity to reflect on Kimmy's presentation and how we can use the information that she gave us to push forward. So facilitators have questions, but it's to guide the discussion. It's not meant to box you into a particular discussion. So please use the time, enjoy interacting with each other as much as you can online. If folks have questions, feel free to reach out via email or text or Google Chat. I will be at my computer, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you all.